From the heart of Orlando, Florida, you are listening to the most electrifying show in media, A Neighbor's Choice. And I'm your host, your neighbor, David Gornoski. So glad to be with you once again in our neighborhood here in Central Florida. We are live and we are ready to go to tackle the real story behind the headlines, giving you the voice of the misfit, the voice of the underdog, the voice of the contrarian every day, Monday through Thursday. That's what we're here for on A Neighbor's Choice, and that's what I seek to accomplish in this endeavor with you. And in order to do that, that means I'm going to give you perspectives that you don't hear on the groupthink media. Perspectives like people with skin in the game in past war conflicts that recognize why we should not be in the conflicts that we're currently being tempted into today. So right now, when you go to most programming, news, radio, or TV, or what have you, you're hearing a bipartisan consensus that we need to do more in Venezuela to help give those people our version of democracy and freedom, that they can't do it on their own, that they need us to help involve ourselves and figure out what they need for a leader. And we on this show think that that smells a little bit like old, tired groupthink. And we're not going to just allow that narrative to go unchallenged. And so because of that, we have with us right now retired U.S. Army Colonel Douglas Macgregor. Douglas, thanks for joining me.
Oh, happy to be with you.
Well, I've enjoyed what you said last night on Tucker Carlson, and you were talking about the Venezuelan conflict and an angle that I didn't hear on any other program on TV that night. And so I thought, who better to give me the real deal information about Venezuela than yourself? Now, you are someone who has a decorated career in the United States military, and I wanted to give briefly a little bit of background. You have a PhD, and you have several books, and your latest is, what is it, Margin of Victory, is that right?
Yes.
And Margin of Victory, which outlines some of the top conflicts and battles, right? Tell us a little bit about your book first.
Well, it covers 5 battles that ultimately ended up being turning points in the history of warfare during the 20th century. It begins in 1914 and it ends in 1991. And it's an attempt to try and understand how militaries do or do not prepare to fight and the consequences and the strategic impact. So I think your readers who have any interest in military affairs would enjoy it. And as I said, it ends in 91. It ends with the Battle of 73 Easting, in which I was personally involved, the largest tank battle since the end of the Second World War. So then we begin to talk about what does it all mean for today and for the future. And the last chapter talks about the future and how we should consider organizing and preparing ourselves for the inevitability of a future major war.
Very good. Now, in the fall of 2001, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, he sought you out, right, to have Tommy Franks talk to you about how to deal with Iraq. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich contacted me on behalf of the Secretary, and based on 2 things. First of all, my combat experience in 91 and what had actually happened on the ground. There were very few of us that saw serious action in 91, and we saw arguably the most significant action in terms of close combat with the Iraqi enemy. And he was interested in my views on how we might approach a future conflict with Iraq, particularly if we decided to intervene for the purpose of removing Saddam Hussein. And I had written a book called Breaking the Phalanx. It was published in January 97, talked about a complete reorganization of the ground force and its integration with air power, and he very much liked that. And I provided him with a view and an approach that was radically different from what the Four Stars wanted. And the Four Stars, as usual, treated Iraq as though it were the Soviet Union and wanted what I call the million-man march into the country. And Rumsfeld's initial purpose was to go in, make the change at the top, put another group of generals in power who would then at some point work to hold elections with the United Nations, and for us then to rapidly withdraw. There was no plan to occupy, because everybody understood that if you tried to occupy the place, you were not going to be successful, because the Muslim population would not accept occupation by effectively a Christian army.
And that's exactly what it turned out to be. Now, why did they go with the whole nation-building strategy instead of just going in and leaving?
Well, you'll recall that this passion for nation-building really begins quite early under the Clinton administration with Madeleine Albright. Madeleine Albright was the one who said to Colin Powell, "I've heard so much about this great army, why can't we use it?" And Colin Powell's view was, well, we can use it if there's a reason for us to do so. In other words, to defend United States strategic interests. And her attitude was, no, we want to make it an instrument of social and political change wherever we choose. And you had a series of interventions, starting in Somalia and Haiti, moving on to Bosnia, and then ultimately with Kosovo. And this was the use of military power to pursue narrow political agendas to transform societies into something that we thought was appropriate based on ourselves. And unfortunately, many of these people were still with us in 2001, and when the opportunity came with 9/11 to expand the horizons of conflict, if you will, and pursue the opportunity to develop, in theory, an Anglo-Saxon democracy on Arab soil that would be friendly to Israel, which was Paul Wolfowitz's argument, the group that we now call Neocons jumped on it. And unfortunately, President Bush uncritically accepted the recommendation. And so in May, after 30 days of inaction by the generals and chaos in Baghdad, Mr. Bremer was sent in to do exactly that, preside over the dismantlement of the state, the army, the administration, the police, and its rebuilding in an American image, which of course had no chance of success. And ultimately today we managed to put Iran in control of Iraq. Iran owes an enormous debt of gratitude to the generals in the Army and the Marine Corps who were instrumental in giving them control of Iraq.
So now you are a critic of our interventionist campaign. So, you were addressing the question on Tucker Carlson last night about, basically the question of how does regime change in Venezuela benefit the U.S.? So, Colonel Macgregor, how does our involvement in Venezuela, does it benefit the U.S.?
Well, truthfully, no. Involving ourselves in Latin America with military power has turned out to be, over the last 100-plus years, a disaster. We've alienated 100 million people in Latin America through our interventions in places like Nicaragua and Cuba and Puerto Rico and elsewhere. And keep in mind that we have this unhappy history of intervention. We intervened more frequently, more often in Cuba than in any other country. We wrote its constitution. We supervised elections. One look at Cuba, it provides you with a glimpse of what happened as a consequence of our intervention in that country. And you would have something similar in Venezuela. The notion that you can go in and impose your notions of societal organization and political structure on another population in a foreign country is absurd. And that's inevitably what's behind the intervention, because the notion is if we can't convert it into a facsimile of ourselves, then we can't control it. And we're not going to be able to do that in Venezuela, and we should not try.
Yeah, and yet we saw yesterday there was kind of like a little surprise coup project that it seemed like it didn't work. So tell us, was that they had this this opposition leader, he does this almost Hollywood-style production on the streets like it's a movie, and then there was supposed to be this idea that some of the Maduro regime leaders were going to defect. Were they setting the U.S. up to look like fools here? Was this a setup by the Maduro regime?
No. The setup was done by the Neocons, who are standing behind Bolton and Pompeo and others, and have surrounded the president and essentially fed him information which is false, with the goal of dragging American military power into Venezuela. They have grossly hyped out of all proportion to reality the Russian presence down there is something significant when it isn't. Russia's economy is smaller than the economy of South Korea. Russia has nothing to offer. And the Russians are only interested in Venezuela as a way to get back at us because of our activities in Ukraine and Georgia and elsewhere in Eastern Europe. Russia's too weak to do anything else. The Chinese were involved in Venezuela, but only economically. And they lost billions of dollars, and they finally walked away from Venezuela. Now, if we were to go down there, we would end up pouring billions of dollars into the country, and I'm sure Mr. Guaido would then turn around and use some of that money to pay off the debt that is owed to China with the goal of bringing them back in. So the whole thing is ridiculous. And then we finally we completely ignore the reality that however much we may not like it, Chavez was legitimately elected, and so was Maduro. Latin America has a long history of supporting Marxism. Not every country, but most of it. And the populations there are very different from our populations. Their culture is very different. They expect to be cared for by the government. The notion of individualism, as we understand it, fierce individualism, independence of government, minimal government, those things are all foreign in Latin America.
We're speaking with Douglas Macgregor. He's the former U.S. Colonel. We'll be right back on Venezuela on the other side. You're listening to A Neighbor's Choice.
The whispers in the morning of lovers sleeping tight are rolling.
Welcome back to A Neighbor's Choice Radio. I'm David Gornoski, your host and your neighbor here in Central Florida. We are live on News Radio 93.1 WFLA. You can also catch us on 540 AM, the 50,000-watt front porch, as Bud Hedinger calls it, across Central Florida. And you can also get us online right now, where we have our Facebook live stream and people are joining us from all over the world. We're talking with Colonel Douglas Macgregor, and I was just exposed to his work last night on Tucker Carlson's program, so I thought it'd be great to have him on to give us the real deal, someone who has spent time in active combat in the largest tank battle in American history since World War II, which took place in Desert Storm. So he's someone who has a decorated career in military, and he understands strategy, and I wanted to learn from him what we need to take away from Venezuela. My program, I think that we should have, as far as in foreign policy, an America First foreign policy. That means we should really have a real strong reason for why we should engage in military combat, and that should be a direct threat to our safety. If a country is indicating that they're planning to attack us, then we should be able to stop them from getting anywhere close to doing that. But I don't see that as what's at play here with Venezuela. But yet people on the nightly news are telling us, oh no, if we let the Venezuelans work this out on their own without us being involved, it's going to be a major threat for us. Do you share that opinion?
No, that's utter nonsense. That makes about as much sense as the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which we know never happened, that was then exploited as a lie to drag us into Vietnam to fight in someone else's civil war on the grounds that what happened in Vietnam would put the existence of civilization and freedom everywhere at risk. Nothing could have been further from the truth. So this is an old ploy. There's nothing new in this. And you're right. If we are not directly attacked, there is no reason for us to involve ourselves in other people's wars and conflicts. And after the collapse of the Soviet state system, we had an opportunity to truly pursue that American First agenda. And sadly, we didn't do it.
Colonel Macgregor, what do you say to people who say if we pull out or we don't get involved, if we don't have our CIA plan who is in power there, that it will create a power vacuum and other vicious forces like Russia and whoever will be having a platform to do things?
Well, as I said earlier, the Russians have almost no Navy to speak of. The Chinese Navy is terrible. Any attempt to militarily influence anything in the Western Hemisphere is hopeless for both of those countries, and I can tell you that the Chinese have no interest in conflict with us militarily. Their interest is purely economic. we need to deal with that. And what the president has done economically vis-a-vis China and these trade relationships and trade agreements is spot on. I agree with him 100%, and we should be interested in protecting our intellectual property, and we should look very seriously at the people who are in our country. That's what we should do, and the president is right about the border. Instead of wasting time worrying about Venezuela, we should be much more concerned with our southern border, because all of the threats that people impute to Venezuela exist in Mexico. They're right across the border, whether it's Hezbollah or Russian intelligence. Mexico always provided the Soviet Union with its largest operation in the Western Hemisphere. And again, historically, Venezuela, Mexico, and Cuba have a long history of being anti-American, anti-Western, and pro-communist. They supported the communist cause during the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. They welcomed everyone from Trotsky to the KGB into the country. Anyone that was hostile to the United States was welcome in Mexico and Cuba, and for the most part in Venezuela. So the notion that you're going to go down and change these people is crazy, but you need to close that border with Mexico. And by closing, I mean, if it's not legitimate commercial traffic, there shouldn't be any. And the place should be under martial law right now. That's the only way to secure our southern border. And then we need to really begin to find out who's in the United States. We know we have at least 30 million illegals. This is outrageous. That's where the president should focus. That's what he ran on. He didn't run on Venezuela. And that's a waste of time, money, and resources.
Do you think that the president is going to dig in and keep going along with Bolton's wing of thought here and double down on trying? It looks like this coup yesterday didn't work.
No.
And he think he's going to back off. He's got a light interest in this.
Well, the president has an opportunity to pivot away from it. In many respects, this is reminiscent, I think, of what happened to President Kennedy when he was elected. He was presented by the CIA with this rosy scenario for the invasion of Cuba by Cuban exiles and expatriates, and told that this would succeed, there would be very little resistance, it all would go well. And he made the mistake of uncritically accepting what the CIA told him, and the CIA is frequently wrong. We have a long track record that proves that. And of course, he was also surrounded by people that kept urging him to act. He wasn't comfortable doing so, but he listened, and he was a victim of the Bay of Pigs. But Kennedy was able to pivot away from it, at least initially. Unfortunately, because he appeared weak, Khrushchev then decided to precipitate the crisis in Cuba. But remember that in those days, we were dealing with the Soviet Union, which was an enormous military power and really was threatening and aggressive, maintained millions under arms. That's not true anymore. And the notion that somehow or another we're dealing with that in Venezuela is nonsense. So I hope he does. He can do it. He can simply say, he can announce, another week or so from now on the 10th of May that Mr. Bolton and Mr. Pompeo have both tendered their resignations. And that would be a very good thing for him to do, and then he can change the subject. The president really controls the narrative. And when he speaks, he changes the subject. And we can move away from that, refocus on the border. He needs to get back to what he ran on and away from this destructive policy approach that's being pushed on him by the neocons.
There are a lot of people in our listening audience in Orlando here that are from Venezuela, and we've had callers on before that are pleading. They think that they have relatives back home in Venezuela who are suffering, and they are convinced that they can't do it without America. Should we be involved at all? What would your perspective be if do we just be a moral voice of condemning the excesses of the Maduro socialist regime, or do we do a light touch? What would be your approach? Because there's a lot of people that have that sensitivity to the plight of people who have lack of resources there.
Well, if you look at our record in Latin America, wherever we have gone with military power, ostensibly to support someone else's revolution, and we did that in Cuba as an example, we inevitably go in, end up killing many people that we wish we hadn't. We end up installing people that are ostensibly going to be our puppets. Those people alienate their own population. The population dislikes the Yankee presence, rebels against it, and in order to be legitimate, they have to throw us out. And we look foolish and stupid as a result. So I think the notion of us intervening anywhere in Latin America to put anyone into power is a serious mistake. And finally, if they can't work this out for themselves, whatever we produce for them isn't going to last. People have to understand that. First, you've got to build your own future. Venezuela can do that if they put their minds to it. But I don't see any evidence right now that that's happening. Instead, what I see is a sort of a Hollywood-style coup being set up by the CIA in the United States, picking someone who is an attractive American potential puppet and trying to put him into power. It's not going to work.
I mean, half the country believes that Russia installed our current president, so it would be akin to China coming into America and saying, hey, we're going to save you from this Russian agent. We're going to install Joe Biden by force. Imagine how the many millions of people in America would react to that. It takes a little bit of common sense to figure this out. We're talking with Colonel Douglas Macgregor. On the other side, we'll dive into more sacred cows and foreign policy. You're listening to A Neighbor's Choice. Don't go anywhere. A Neighbor's Choice Radio is back, and I'm your host, David Gornoski. So glad you could join us, where we're solving the problems not by relying on TV groupthink, but by having a little bit of skin in the game, having a little common sense, and thinking through these things as adults together. We're interested in freedom. We're interested in prosperity. We want everyone to succeed. We want everyone to be in win-win solutions. And that's why we have people like we have right now, Colonel Douglas Macgregor, who's a former colonel in the U.S. Army. He's also a Ph.D. and author of the new book, Margin of Victory, which outlines some of the, 5 battles you said?
Yes.
5
battles of the 20th century.
Five battles, the most pivotal battles of the 20th century. So check it out, Margin of Victory. And learn about the real kind of inside scoop. You were in the last battle there, which was in Desert Storm that you had there. Tell us a little bit about that, just briefly. Give us a snapshot of your experience there.
Well, some of your listeners may remember that in 1990 and 91, this picture of an enormous military power in Iraq was presented to the American people. In other words, if you looked at Iraq, you were seeing something on the scale of the Soviet armed forces. Of course, nothing could be further from the truth, and no Arab army had defeated a European force for at least 500 years. And the Israelis, the Egyptians, the British, the French, everyone told us privately, this is not the force that you think it is. But we had no one at the top who had any experience maneuvering large forces. The people that were in charge were Vietnam veterans. Frankly, most of them were traumatized based on their experience during that war. They feared the consequences of casualties, all sorts of things. And so they imagined a powerful enemy that didn't exist. We were the lead unit in the 7th Corps, so we had 3.5 days of periodic contact with the Iraqi military on the way up there, which was a very good thing for us because we were able to take their measure. And since we were, as most troops were at the time, green in the sense that we had not seen direct fire combat, this cavalry squadron of 1,100 men, 42 tanks, 42 Bradleys, 12 guns, we ended up fighting the Republican Guard, its rear detachment, because the Republican Guard was given time to withdraw, unfortunately, so we ended up colliding with the rear guard, quite by accident, frankly, because the people above us didn't want us to, and we annihilated them. And that's the best way I can put it. We annihilated a unit of about 2,500 men and 39 tanks and 40 or 50 other armored fighting vehicles and hundreds of other trucks and equipment in the space of perhaps 40 minutes. Then we were subjected to a number of counterattacks because we weren't allowed to move any further In other words, we couldn't exploit the attack. So after a period of several hours, about 8 total, the field of battle was strewn with the wreckage of thousands of Iraqi troops and equipment. It was a stupendous victory for us. We lost 1 armored fighting vehicle. 1 man was killed, unfortunately, and 6 were wounded. But the rest of us, the rest of the 1,100, we were very much intact. And it was a tribute to the quality of the performance of the American soldier at his best. He had been trained, organized, and equipped to fight the Soviets. But it was also a measure of the difference between a modern scientific industrial state and its armed forces and a very backward Arab country that was still mired in tribalism and in this transition somewhere between the ancient world or the pre-modern world and the modern world. So it was a no contest. It was essentially a fight between, a professional football team and a junior high school football team.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, no one told the truth about that, and instead we declared victory and assured everyone that we were perfect and nothing changed. And so for the last 25 years, 26 years, we've had no change in the structure, organization, equipment, nothing, which is a big mistake. And that's one of the reasons I wrote Margin of Victory.
We're speaking with Colonel Douglas Macgregor, author of Margin of Victory, 5 Battles That Changed the Face of Modern War. And if you'd like to join in and have a question, you can call in at 866-916-5400. We'll open the phone lines now, 866-916-5400. Or if you have a comment by text, you can text it at 23680 if you have something you'd like to chip in here. But Colonel Macgregor, so you were there in Desert Storm, and so I like to hear from people with skin in the game. A lot of these people in the neocons, they're chicken hawks, and they don't really ever go to war, but they've never found a war that they didn't want to be involved in, unless it's like Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is hands off, and they don't want to touch them. Even though I was just seeing the headlines about how they beheaded a 16-year-old boy because he was texting negative things about the regime. So it's so, the neocons always tell us that they're for freedom and democracy, but they're really just liars. And I don't know how they have so much power, because I guess it's just because they've got friends in high places in media, because they have this massive echo chamber on all the newspapers and TV outlets, but their arguments are so ridiculous, and they've made such egregious blunders in generations, almost a generation now here, and since their rise to power. But what do you think about their argument that we need to do something about Iran? You were over there in the Middle East. Is Iran the big threat that they're saying it is?
No, not at all. Iran's principal export, just like Venezuela, is oil and gas. These economies are very weak, although the Iranians, remarkably enough, have managed to diversify somewhat and resist the damage that's been inflicted on them. But, we spend more to build, train, and equip one carrier battle group in the United States Navy than Iran spends in a year on its armed forces. It has no capability to project power beyond its borders except a very small group called the Pasdaran. This is the group that the State Department recently designated as terrorists, but in truth, they have been employed exclusively in support of Shiites who have been facing imminent extermination at the hands of Sunni Arab and Turkish Islamists. And so that's really what it's about in the Middle East. I think it gains a lot of attention because of the war of words between Israel and Iran more than anything else, and we're dragged in because of our close relationship with Israel.
So, how do you see this playing out? Do you think that, again, I know that we're just kind of speculating here, but do you see Trump making a move to have involvement on the ground with Iran, or do you think he's just trying to bring them to heel with the sanctions?
I see no evidence that President Trump has any interest in beginning a war anywhere with anyone.
Right.
He's made that very clear. That's one promise that thus far he's kept. And I think he will continue to do so because I think he understands that a war will destroy his presidency. Wars have destroyed multiple presidencies in the 20th century and in this century. He knows that. So, no, I don't see that happening at all. That doesn't preclude efforts by others to essentially mislead and misinform the president, much as I pointed out happened with John F. Kennedy and the Bay of Pigs operation. So I think, no, there will be no war with Iran, and the Iranians have no interest in going to war with us. So unless we're very stupid and they're very stupid, nothing will happen.
Do you think that Bolton and Lindsey Graham and these folks, do they really want war, or do they just blustering a lot to try to benefit the Iran's regional rivals?
Well, you have to look at the people that donate to those individuals. Mr. Bolton has become very, very rich and is in the position he's in because of his unconditional support for the Israeli lobby. He is their man on the ground in the White House. The same thing is largely true for Mr. Pompeo. He has aspirations to be president. He has his hands out for money from the Israeli lobby, the Saudis, and others. Unfortunately, these people think that we are so powerful that we can do anything we want. There are no consequences, at least none for them. Unfortunately, the consequences issue is true. If you go back over the last 18 years, who's being held accountable for losing trillions of dollars, killing millions of people overseas, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Africa? And what about the 50-plus thousand U.S. casualties? The Americans, the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who've either been killed or whose lives have been destroyed. And who's being held accountable? Who's being brought forward and asked, why did you do X? Who gave you authority? No one's done that. And so I think the neocons in the White House and their friends on the Hill are all of the same mind. We can get away with it. We can do whatever we want. No one cares. The American people are asleep.
Yeah, I remember Ahmadinejad, Glenn Beck used to say in 2006 that Ahmadinejad in Iran was going to wipe out the whole the whole world, and there was apocalypse on the way. And isn't he like a university professor or something, and they banned him from running again? And
I don't know. I mean, Ahmadinejad was a zero. The point is that the Iranian population doesn't much care for its government, would like to see the mullahs out of business. They're living in a theocracy that they don't like for the most part, but unfortunately, if you attack them, they will defend their country, and you will unite the population against us and in support of that government.
That's just like 9/11. Remember with Bush, he was very unpopular coming in, and then the 9/11 attacks happened, and he had 90% approval rating for a little while. So it shows you the logic of what you're saying, that when we're saber rattle against these people's leaders, it actually destroys the internal opposition against these unsavory regimes.
Well, people don't understand the real historical record. Americans throughout the 20th century have opposed our involvement in wars overseas. They soured on them very, very quickly. We went into the Philippines, we removed the Spanish presence, and then we made the catastrophic decision to occupy the place for the purpose of teaching them to be good citizens in a new democracy. We killed 250,000 Filipinos in the process. One of history's great war crimes. We recognized we'd made a terrible mistake. Teddy Roosevelt understood that by 1909, and we spent the next 30, 40 years trying to get out of the Philippines, which was a money pit for us, and it didn't work until after the Second World War. We've done this sort of thing before. We had no business being involved in World War I, and the American people were adamantly opposed to being involved in World War II. And people don't understand that by the time you get to January of 1945, the polls are turning decisively against Franklin Roosevelt. People want the war over. FDR was very frustrated with the military leadership in Europe and kept saying to General Marshall, what's wrong with these generals? Don't they understand we've got to end this war? We need to bring the boys home. The American people want an end to it. He was right. And ultimately, that's why, at the end of the war, we dismantled the force. I know everybody's seen the movie Patton, and Patton says we ought to use this army against the Soviets. But the truth is, there was no appetite at all for fighting anymore.
Yeah, it's always been the socialists and the leftists that have always wanted these perpetual wars to create their massive government machinery. So if you're truly conservative, truly love liberty, you do not want to buy the lies of the wars that we hear on nightly news and TV, newspapers, and so on. Thanks.
Well, that's right. And you've got the other problem of preemptive war, because that's the other neocon argument. If we don't immediately kill everyone in Iran or kill whomever that the neocons have chosen to attack, they will kill us. It was back to your friend Glenn Beck talking about Ahmadinejad. Let's have a preemptive strike. Bismarck used to say preemptive war is analogous to committing suicide in fear of death. He was right.
Well, very good. Colonel Douglas Macgregor, Margin of Victory is the book. Get it on Amazon today. 5 battles that changed the face of modern war. Hope to have you on again sometime.
Thank you, David.
We'll be right back. You're listening to A Neighbor's Choice. I'm David Gornoski. More to come. Hi, I'm David Gornoski, and you're listening to A Neighbor's Choice. If you want to email me, you can at hello@aneighborschoice.com. Or if you have a comment, you can always post it on our Facebook live stream or call us at 866-916-5400. And we just spoke with Colonel Macgregor, who, here's an example of someone with real skin in the game, unlike a lot of the talking head pundits that you see on nightly TV. And they squawk and squawk and squawk about war, but they've many times never been, and they don't have any of their children planning to be in. And yet they are always pushing for war. We should do more in Venezuela. We should do more in Iran. We should do more in Yemen, they tell us. And yet they don't know what it's like. Meanwhile, we have people like Colonel Macgregor, who actually was in combat in the largest tank battle in American history since World War II. And he's telling us, no, we don't need to be in there. So who are you going to listen to? The chicken hawks on your television squawk box? They're just going to squawk. They've never found a war. You heard the colonel. People like John Bolton, they've made a lot of money shilling for war. And you'll never tell you that we need to spread democracy to Saudi Arabia. Oh, wow. I think these fools should wear the same. We should pass a law. I'm not for a lot of laws being passed. You know that. But if we're going to pass a law, we should have a law that all these pundits and these silly little people that we see on the old dinosaur media, they should be required to wear the same kind of uniform that NASCAR drivers do, where you see all the logos of all the countries and groups that sponsor them. We should be able to see all the logos of these people that get money from foreign countries, and they work for think tanks that get money from foreign countries that don't have America's interest in mind. We should be able to see full clarity when these liars on TV, on NBC and ABC and CBS and CIA and all those news outlets that work together, we should be able to see who their dollars come from. Which military groups do they get, or military industrial corporations that make money off of weapons and toothbrushes and so forth, and bilk and treat the soldiers with disrespect by always pushing them into some no-win conflict we shouldn't be in. We should know who these fools are, and we should see who their sponsors are clearly, so that when you see these squawking head fools on television every night, you'll be able to see, oh, there it is. Oh, here's this corporation. Or there's Halliburton, or there's Qatar, or there's Saudi Arabia, and it shows the dollar. We should be able to see those logos on their little suits. We'll put little badges on them, and they have to walk around with those if they want to sell war. That's truth in advertising, don't you think? They have to tell you truth in advertising for other things. Why don't they have truth in advertising for the merchants of war and the merchants of chicken hawk foreign policy? Well, on this program, we don't have any time for those fools. So we're not going to waste our time listening to their lies. We're going to cut through the noise and let you know the truth. America has no reason to be intervening and telling Venezuela who should be their leader. If they have to have their freedom, they have to work it out themselves. And if you, as an individual, want to help them with freedom, there are plenty of ways you can help yourself. You can go over there. You can support groups and charity groups. You can get on a boat and go there and help them out yourself, but do not coerce your neighbor to expropriate his resources like a socialist into helping your desire to micromanage the affairs of another nation. And do not coerce your neighbor to expropriate his or her resources to intervene in who should be Iran's leaders. People have never even been to Iran, and yet they want to tell them who their leader should be. Again, imagine if China came into America and said, hey, we heard on your television that you guys were invaded by a Russian agent with Trump. So we're going to install who we think you should have. So we've decided to install Ocasio-Cortez or whoever it is, right? Imagine that they did that. How would the American public feel if China just came in and said, we heard that you guys were in distress. We heard that you guys were invaded by an ally of Putin in the form of Trump. So we're going to install a more democratically fair candidate who represents the fairness and the interests of the people. Would you like that? I mean, there's a lot of Democrats right now that hate Trump, that they would actually support Trump if they saw China roll up into our country. So imagine when we do that in other countries, they're still human beings just like you, and they do not want another foreign power coming into their neighborhoods and their community and telling them who they should have and installing their leadership for them. They don't want that. So stay out of it. Stop listening to the lies on television. We need to respect and honor our troops and bring them home so they can enjoy their time with their families. We should honor them. We should stop disrespecting troops by sending them into never-ending no-win wars for chicken hawks who make money off of lies. Those guys have no place in our republic. They have no place in the land of the free, and they have no place in any kind of conversation about what America's interests really are. Once again, you've heard the truth and nothing but on A Neighbor's Choice. Stay out of banks and brothels, would you? There's very little profit to be had in either one. Rather, continue the pursuit. I'm David Gornoski. Godspeed.